I joined the monastery. I'm chanting. Got my plant. Gonna get YouTube famous. All right. So, we're born, our bodies grow, they expand, they mature, and then they start to age, decay, and die. Okay, so that's physical growth, right? I've drawn the pictures. That's that arc, and then that's for body. So spirit, which is going to be intellectual, emotional, spiritual growth, is the inverse. So that's the body, and then the inverse is this one. Okay, so we're going to look at that model. We're going to look at growing up intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and what that looks like from a different model, okay, to kind of help us try to understand this. Now, the growth cycle of your body is pretty concrete. Like, it is going to follow that pattern. Like, you can't escape that. Like, we're going to die. Intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, it's kind of separate. Like, it's fluid, and it doesn't necessarily have a concrete like path. Like, it's not fixed. Like, the body is fixed. Spiritual, intellectual, emotional growth is not really fixed. I mean, you see, so we're gonna we're gonna look at this today. All right, so we got our graphic organizer here for the day. Ooh, I use the big board, and the boards, it's all problems. Problems. Do what my last video, what do what you want, do it is hard. This is hard. All right. So we got our 3 spheres. Every one of us, if we've made it to adulthood, physically, conceptually, we should have a child in us, which is cared for by others. We should have a teenager or young adult, which cares for self. And we should have our adult, which cares for self and others. On this side, we got the chakras. According to Ken Keyes, security, sensation. In the sphere of child, power. And the sphere of the young adult, love's kind of in there too, but love should be more right, like in between. And then faith, concentration, and insight for the sphere of adult. Whoa, there we go, switch inside. Whoa, didn't work. And then on this side, we have accumulate, the gradient scale. As we ascend, we're in an accumulation phase. And then as we ascend these spheres, we go into a create phase. So we're accumulating down here, and then we're going to start creating up here. And then at some level, there's going to be a transmute barrier, which is where we're transmuting everything that we've accumulated into some type of creation, whether it's a negative or a positive creation. So if we've accumulated negative things, if we've accumulated negative emotional, intellectual input from caregivers and people in our lives, that might unconsciously create negative things, destruction. Okay, if we're able to consciously look at that, we can transmute that into positive creation. Okay, if we've accumulated positive experiences unconsciously, that's going to lead to positive creations. Okay, so we can become conscious of that. We don't need to transmute anything. We can just expand our creations. Okay, so this is the model we're kind of working with. So now I'm gonna pause it here, guys. Got it. All right, so just as the physical growth cycle is like a process, the spiritual, intellectual, emotional growth cycle is a process also. Now, because our bodies are fixed, the growth of our bodies is fixed, that process is happening. Nothing's going to stop it unless we die early, okay? So, but this intellectual, spiritual, and emotional growth process is not fixed. So, like, when we're children, and we're being cared for by others, because that's what children do. That's what they need. They need care from others. When that care is met, that process is completed. When we're able to live as children, learn healthy limits, learn healthy choices, that process becomes completed. When we're in a family, because a child is a part of a family, and we get to see a healthy family model as children, that childhood process becomes completed. Okay, so, and then once we reach a certain stage where the childhood process in our intellectual, emotional, and spiritual development has become completed, we can move on to the young adult teenager phase of our development. And then we can start completing those processes. So, being cared for by others. If, as children, we are not cared for properly by others, that puts, it halts the process. It halts the process. I had an experience working with a grown man who was a convicted pedophile. And I trained this person for 5 weeks without knowing that he had that in his history and was that person. And upon working with this person, I realized that he was a child emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. And that's why he thought that it would be okay on whatever level to interact with children in that way, because he emotionally and spiritually and intellectually was not capable of discerning, so that was an interesting experience for me. A little sidebar there, but it sounded like he had a very traumatic childhood also. So there you go. Those factors, they stop people from moving beyond. Okay, so that's trauma loop phenomenon. Trauma happens. Neglect is a form of trauma. Improper modeling of choices and limits is kind of traumatic. So all those things work to stop that process. The process gets halted. It's stopped. Okay. So the body's moving on. The physical, hormonal changes of the body are occurring. They're taking place. But emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, we're not going with it. You see? And so that can create a lot of problems for the person in life. Okay? So if we're stuck in child mode, we're going to be stuck there for a while. Okay? But moving on, say we made it into the young adult world here, the teenager world. Now that's governed by power and love. Love is kind of more in the middle of adult, and I put it in the wrong spot kind of, but now power, because we have the capability to care for ourselves as young adults and teenagers. If we were modeled properly, choices and limits as children, and we were cared for properly by others in our lives, we're going to be able to express this love of self, and we're going to be able to develop and care of self, and we're going to be able to develop by forming our identities and making plans to do things and carry out goals and take up interests and hobbies and sports and all the stuff that kind of teenagers start to do for themselves. If we had experienced neglect or trauma, the teenager's not going to be in the teenager phase emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, and they're going to exhibit some different types of behaviors that are going to be reflective of self-harming behaviors. They're not going to be caring for themselves properly. This is where drug use can start for a lot of people who weren't cared for properly as children, because that emotional, spiritual, intellectual process wasn't completed for them. But if it was completed for them, we start to learn and develop the power to choose who and what we want to be and who and what we're going to be. Okay? So this process, if and this is successive, so if this process was completed properly, then this process is going to have a solid foundation for itself to complete itself properly. Now, I was cared for, but I wasn't cared for appropriately. I was over cared for. So this created a very shaky foundation for my adolescent growth because I was going to be and do something that was a little unreasonable because it's all about integrating self, others, and world. And my worldview was not realistic because I did not have a solid foundation here to model that to me. So I was kind of a little far out here. But if it's not far out, you're going to see kids and they're going to start making healthy choices. They're going to be expressing themselves in the ways they want to be. And if this wasn't completed properly, people are going to start using drugs, harming themselves, other types of harming behaviors. So after we develop mature physically, we're going to reach this love, care for self, perfect or met, like in the pictures I've shown you before. And then we're going to come into the adult self where we can care for self and others, okay? If we were able to grow up, complete the teenage process, go on our trips, our journeys, that's in conventional world, that's college. I don't know that college is really the best place for that, but yeah, I traveled the world. I hiked. I did a lot of things, and that allowed me to healthfully complete this sphere and then move on into adulthood. Now, in adulthood, you're caring for self and you're caring for others. So your level of responsibility is drastically increased because therefore you get to care for all these people in different ways in your life. Like care and responsibility go together. Like I like how Sadhguru says in his book Inner Engineering, he says, responsibility is your ability to respond to a situation. So caring goes along with that. It goes hand in hand with that. If you have no care for yourself, you cannot be responsible for anything. If you can care for yourself, but you don't care about anybody else, you can be somewhat responsible for yourself. If you can care for yourself and you can care for others, then you can be very responsible for the people around you. But that is the result of the emotional, intellectual, and spiritual development process. Like your measure of potential as a human being is your ability to care. Okay, so so as an adult, having the ability to care for yourself and others, that's where you can start a family and you can try to recreate, because we've accumulated input from others, we've accumulated our own life experiences, and then we can accumulate, wealth, money, jobs, families, so we can therefore pass that down to them and complete the entire life cycle process, right? So if we accumulate a lot of negative input and negative experiences, and then we accumulate a lot of negative creations, then we're going to pass that down to our children. And then they're going to create that cycle. They're all fractals. It just goes like this, like the spirographs. You do the circles and they slowly make a circle go around themselves. Like it's just this fractal law, right? So, but we need to be able to complete these processes in a healthy way if we want to be able to create positively for ourselves and our families, and then be able to share and spread that down with them. Okay, so with the chakra model here up at the adult world, we got faith, concentration, and insight. And why are those important? Because it's really difficult to care for others and care for yourself. And those are the components. This is religion. Faith is religion. It's not just religion. Religion is the highest form of faith that a person can take in terms of getting through, believing beyond, and sometimes faith is just, I can make it through the day. I mean, sometimes that's all that's required is I can make it through the day. Concentration, we need to be out of our heads. We need to be able to put ourselves lower sometimes than other people so we can care for other people, because sometimes my needs might not be what somebody else's needs are, and I have to, okay, well, it's more important to care for this person and just settle my needs, and then I can come back and care for myself and fulfill my own needs. And then the insight, which comes from concentration. Okay, so that's really important there. But my wrap up here, hold on, I need to pause it again, guys. My wrap up is that as we interact with people in our worlds, and even as we interact with ourselves in our own world, we're not always going to be wherever we are. Like it's fluid, right? Sometimes I have an inner child in me, and I have an inner teenager in me, and I have some sense of adult in me, and I'm not always going to be in my adult brain. Sometimes I'm going to be in my child brain. Sometimes I'm going to be in my teenager brain, and my family, my wife, my husband, my boss, my coworkers, all the people I have to interact with in life, they're not always going to be in their adult brain. Maybe some of them never made it to adulthood. Like the guy I trained and worked with, he was a child. Okay, so I expected of him to be an adult, but he could never be an adult because he was a child in his brain, right? So it's important to understand and acknowledge this reality in terms of our spiritual, emotional, and intellectual growth, because this helps us interact compassionately and deal with the people in our lives as opposed to reactively, right? So it's caring and responding. How do we carefully respond to these people in our life, to ourselves? Like if you can see what happened to you in your past, oh, maybe you had some negative care, negative input, neglect happen to you as a child, and you weren't able to move on. Maybe you need to look at that, accept that about yourself, be compassionate about yourself. It wasn't your fault, and then work on developing and changing that process. And how do we develop and change that process? Self work, self, working on yourself, self examination. Whatever it takes for you to look at the things in your life that have stopped you from completing this process or not allowing you to move on in this process, and they express themselves in your daily life, whatever those things are, then you got to deal with them. And it's a slow journey, and we're all on it. And if you want to be the most maximized as a human, we have to learn how to care for ourselves, our others, and our world. Okay. All right, cool. Well, thank you for listening and watching. 16 minutes wasn't the time I really wanted to do, but you know what? I hope you got something out of it. Thank you. And